If you hold it in your hand, it feels impossibly light. It is made of embroidered silk, perhaps stained with the fading dye of pink or red. It is decorated with intricate patterns of birds and flowers. It is beautiful, in the way a taxidermy butterfly is beautiful. But the most striking thing about it is the size. It is 3 inches long. It fits in the palm of your hand. It looks like a shoe made for a doll, or perhaps a toddler learning to take her first steps. But this was not made for a child. This was made for a grown woman. We are looking at the Golden Lotus. For 1,000 years, this object was the ultimate symbol of femininity, status, and desirability in the Middle Kingdom. But today, we are going to strip away the silk and the embroidery. We are going to look past the poetry and the romance. We are going to place this phenomenon under the cold light of a medical examination lamp. What we find inside this shoe is not beauty. It is a crime scene. It is a systematic, anatomical dismantling of the human foot, a prison made of cloth that locked millions of women into a lifetime of disability. This is not fashion. This is body modification taken to the level of pathology. To understand the pathology, we must identify the patient zero. The virus began in the 10th century, in the decadence of the southern Tang court. The emperor, Li Yu, had a favorite concubine. She was a dancer. To please him, she bound her feet with silk ribbons into the shape of a crescent moon, dancing on the tips of her toes inside a 6-foot golden lotus flower. At that moment, it was a performance. It was a specific aesthetic choice, no different perhaps than a ballerina dancing endpoint. But unlike ballet, where the dancer removes the shoe and rests her feet, the obsession with the golden lotus mutated. It spread from the court to the aristocracy, and then, like a slow-moving plague, it infected the general population. By the Song dynasty, it was no longer a dance. It was a requirement. The process of creating a golden lotus was a medical trauma that spanned years. It did not happen to adults. You cannot bend the bones of an adult. It had to happen to children, usually between the ages of 4 and 6, when the skeletal structure was still soft, when the cartilage had not yet fully ossified into hard bone. Let us analyze the procedure with clinical detachment. The goal was to reshape the foot into a hoof. The mother, or a professional binder, would take long strips of cotton cloth. The process began by seizing the 4 smaller toes, the 2nd through the 5th. These toes were not just squeezed, they were forced downwards and backwards, curled under the sole of the foot. Imagine the anatomy of your own foot. The metatarsal bones are designed to splay, to distribute weight. In binding, these long bones were physically broken or dislocated to allow the toes to fold completely under the sole. The flesh of the toes would eventually become pressed into the flesh of the heel. But the toes were only the beginning. The second stage was more severe. The goal was to shorten the foot itself. The binder would pull the heel and the toes toward each other, forcibly arching the instep. This effectively broke the longitudinal arch of the foot, the navicular bone, the talus, and the calcaneus. The complex machinery of the ankle and midfoot were crushed into a vertical alignment. The foot was effectively folded in half. This was not a painless adjustment. The pain was excruciating and constant. For the first 2 years, the child lived in a state of acute agony. The circulation was cut off. The tissue, deprived of blood flow, would often succumb to necrosis. It was common for the flesh to rot. In many cases, the toes would simply die and fall off, a phenomenon that was actually welcomed because it made the foot smaller. The binders would force the girl to walk on these broken bones. The weight of the body pressing down on the fractures was necessary to crush the foot into its new, permanent shape. If the binding was too loose, the foot would recover. So, the bindings were tightened, day after day, year after year, until the bones fused in this deformed position. By the time the girl was a teenager, the transformation was complete. She no longer had human feet. She had a triangular stump, a pointed extension of the leg that tapered to a point. The heel bone was vertical. The arch was a deep cleft in which you could hide a silver dollar. This is what lay beneath the silk shoe: twisted bones, calloused skin, trapped perspiration, and often a lingering scent of decay. Now, let us deconstruct the movement. The poets of the time wrote ecstatic verses about the lotus gait. They described women swaying like willows in the wind, moving with a fragile, delicate grace that drove men wild. But looking at this through the lens of biomechanics, we see the truth. The swaying was not an aesthetic choice. It was a strategy for keeping upright. A normal human foot acts as a tripod. The heel, the big toe, and the little toe form a stable base. A bound foot removed that base. The woman was essentially walking on peg legs. She had no heel support. She had no ability to push off with her toes. She was in a constant state of falling forward, catching herself with small, mincing steps. To compensate for the loss of the calf muscle, which atrophied, because the ankle was locked, the muscles of the thigh and the glutes had to work overtime. They became hypertrophic. This physical instability forced the woman to clench her pelvic floor muscles with every step just to maintain her balance. The irony is horrific. The fragility that men found so attractive was actually a symptom of severe physical handicap. The woman looked like she needed to be supported because she did need to be supported. She was structurally compromised. This leads us to the most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon, the cultural fetishization of the deformity. Over the centuries, the Golden Lotus became dissociated from the suffering human being attached to it. It became an object of worship in itself. Men wrote manuals classifying feet into 9 ranks of quality. They obsessed over the shape, the smell, the texture of the cloth. There was a ritual, popular among certain literati, that perfectly encapsulates this sickness. It was called the shoe cup. During banquets, men would remove the tiny shoe from a courtesan's foot. They would place a small cup of wine inside the shoe, or sometimes pour the wine directly into the silk vessel, and then they would drink from it. Think about the dissociation required for this act. The shoe was a casing for a crushed, often infected, appendage. Yet, these men, the intellectuals of the empire, treated it as a chalice. They were drinking from a symbol of their own dominance. They were not worshipping the woman. They were worshipping her destruction. They were worshipping the fact that she had been broken for them. Why did this persist? Why did mothers inflict this torture on their daughters for 1,000 years? It was not because they hated their children. It was because they loved them. In a society where women had no economic power, marriage was the only survival strategy. And in the marriage market, the Golden Lotus was the primary currency. A girl with large, natural feet, derisively called duck feet, was unmarriageable. She would be relegated to the status of a peasant or a servant. To bind a daughter's feet was to buy her a ticket to a better life. It was a brutal calculus. Break her bones now, so she does not starve later. Furthermore, the binding served a darker social function. It was a physical guarantee of chastity. A woman who cannot walk more than a few hundred yards without exhaustion, cannot run away, she cannot travel, she cannot have an affair. She is effectively under house arrest, anchored by her own body. The Golden Lotus turned a woman into the ultimate sedentary possession, a trophy that sat on a shelf, unable to move unless carried. This was a prison made of cloth and bone. The practice survived the rise and fall of dynasties. It survived the Mongol invasion. It survived the Manchu conquest. It was so deeply embedded in the cultural psyche that when the Qing emperors tried to ban it, they failed. The desire for the broken foot was stronger than the imperial decree. It was not until the 20th century, with the influx of Western medicine and the rise of feminist movements, that the bindings began to loosen. But it did not vanish overnight. There are women alive today, the very last of a generation, who still bear these scars. If you look at X-rays of these elderly women, you see the fossilized evidence of this history. You see the metatarsals folded like a fan. You see the heel bone sitting vertically. It looks less like a foot and more like the hoof of a grazing animal. The story of the Golden Lotus is not just a story about China or about the past. It is a universal story about what happens when a society decides that pain is a prerequisite for beauty. It is a warning about how easily we can become desensitized to suffering if that suffering is wrapped in silk and given a poetic name. We look at the shoe today, sitting in a museum case. It is small, it is delicate, it is embroidered with flowers, but we must never forget what fit inside it. It was not a foot. It was a testament to the human capacity to endure and the societal capacity to inflict, a torture that was disguised as love. It was a 3-inch coffin for the living body.